You don't see yourself clearly, and it's costing you more than you think. You think you know who you are, what you're capable of, what you're not, where you stand in life, and what kind of person you've become. That sense of self feels solid. It feels earned. It feels like something you can trust. But here's what most people never stop to question. What if that image isn't actually you? Not because something is wrong with you, but because the version of yourself you believe in wasn't built through honest reflection. It was built through exposure, through what got accepted and what got rejected, through what was praised, criticized, ignored, or rewarded, over years and years of quiet conditioning. And at some point you stopped questioning it. You just started living inside it. You call it being realistic, grounded, self-aware. But there's a difference between knowing yourself and having learned to see yourself in a certain way. One is clarity. The other is a pattern you've never examined. And that pattern is costing you more than you realize. Every time you hesitate when something inside you says move. Every time you doubt a capability you actually have. Every time you hold back without fully understanding why. That's not caution. That's not wisdom. That's a distorted lens doing its job, quietly, consistently, invisibly. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, Book 5, that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. But what happens when the imagination in question is the one you have about yourself? What happens when the story you carry about who you are is the very thing limiting what you do? This is not a motivation problem. It's not about working harder or wanting it more. It's a perception problem. And perception problems are invisible by nature, because you can't see the lens you're looking through. You only see what it shows you. So before anything else, ask yourself this. If the way you see yourself is inaccurate, and there's a very real chance it is, how many of your decisions have been shaped by that inaccuracy? How many opportunities did you pass on? How many times did you shrink when you didn't have to? And more importantly, what has that already cost you? The image you trust is incomplete. There's an image you carry of yourself. It travels with you into every decision, every conversation, every moment where something is asked of you, and most of the time you don't even notice it's there. It just operates quietly in the background, telling you what you're capable of, what's realistic for you, and what kind of person you are. You trust it. Of course you do. It feels like self-knowledge. It feels like the honest result of years of experience. But here's what that image actually is. It's a construction, built from everything that happened to you before you were old enough to evaluate it critically. Built from what your environment rewarded and what it punished, from what the people around you reflected back, and from the moments that quietly taught you who you were allowed to be. You didn't choose the raw material. Your mind did what it always does. It found a pattern, built a narrative, and then protected that narrative as if it were fact. And that protection is subtle. You unconsciously filter information to match the image you already hold. Evidence that confirms it gets noticed. Evidence that challenges it gets minimized, explained away, or simply ignored. So when someone tells you that you're more capable than you think, something inside you resists. Not because they're wrong, but because what they're saying doesn't fit the version of you your mind has already filed away. Marcus Aurelius returned to this again and again in his Meditations. Before a person could act rightly, they had to see clearly. And seeing clearly meant questioning what the mind presented as obvious, including assumptions about yourself. He wasn't talking about self-doubt. He was talking about something more demanding. The willingness to hold your own self-image up to the light and ask, is this true? Or is this just familiar? Most people never ask that question. Not because they're incapable of it, but because the image feels so natural, so obviously accurate, that it never occurs to them to question it. And that's exactly what makes it so powerful. An incomplete image of yourself doesn't feel incomplete. It feels like reality. And so you operate inside it without ever testing its edges, without ever asking whether the boundaries you believe in are real, or whether they're simply the shape of the mold you were poured into a long time ago. The question isn't whether your self-image is accurate. The question is, what parts of you never made it into the image at all? And if those parts were left out, where did they go? The version that got approved. At some point in your life, you learned something important. Not in a classroom, not from a book, but from the way people responded to you. You learned which parts of yourself were welcome and which parts were better kept quiet. Maybe it was something small. A reaction that told you enthusiasm was too much. A silence that taught you certain opinions weren't worth sharing. A moment where you tried something and the response, or the lack of it, made you decide not to try that again. These moments didn't feel like lessons at the time. They felt like life. But they were shaping something deep. Over time, you began to present the version of yourself that worked. The version that got accepted, that avoided friction, that kept things smooth. And here's where it gets subtle. You didn't do this consciously. You weren't performing, you were adapting. And adaptation is intelligent. It's how we survive environments that don't fully accept us. But survival and clarity are not the same thing. Because what happened to the parts that didn't get approved? They didn't disappear, they got pushed down. Quietly, gradually, they moved out of your conscious identity and into something harder to see. Carl Jung called this the shadow. Not a dramatic concept, but a precise one. The shadow is simply the parts of yourself that were never integrated into the identity you built for public life. Not because they were wrong or dangerous, but because they weren't accepted or didn't fit the version of you that others needed you to be. And here's what Jung understood that most people resist. Those parts don't go quiet just because you stop acknowledging them. They continue to operate beneath the surface, outside your awareness, shaping your reactions, your discomfort, your inexplicable resistance to certain things. You feel it sometimes, a pull towards something you can't quite justify, an irritation that seems disproportionate, a longing that doesn't fit the story you tell about yourself. That's not noise. That's the rest of you, trying to be seen. You weren't just shaped by what was accepted. You were quietly diminished by what wasn't. And the most unsettling part is that you probably can't fully see where that diminishment ends and where the real you begins. Which means the version of yourself you've been living as, the one that feels most natural, most honest, most like you, may be smaller than what you actually are. And if that's true, then the decisions coming from that version of you have been smaller too. The decisions that were never really yours. You believe you make choices, and in a literal sense you do. You weigh options, you consider consequences, you decide. But here's what most people never examine. Where do those choices actually come from? What's operating underneath the reasoning, before the reasoning even begins? Because most of what feels like a decision is actually a response, a pattern running so automatically that it bypasses conscious deliberation entirely. You don't choose to hesitate, you just hesitate. You don't decide to pull back, you just pull back. And then, a moment later, your mind produces a reason that makes it feel like a choice, a logical explanation, a justification that sounds like wisdom. But the hesitation came first, the reason came second. Epictetus was direct about this in the Discourses. He taught that most people live their entire lives reacting, not choosing. Moved by impressions they never stop to examine, driven by habits of perception they inherited without consent. His central question wasn't what should I do, it was what is actually happening inside me right now, and is it true? That distinction between reacting and choosing was, for him, the entire project of a conscious life. Think about the last time you didn't pursue something you actually wanted, a conversation you avoided, an opportunity you let pass, a version of yourself you almost expressed and then quietly pulled back. What did it feel like in that moment? It probably felt reasonable, measured, maybe even mature. But underneath that reasonableness, what was actually there? Fear dressed as caution, old rejection dressed as realistic thinking, a pattern formed years ago in a completely different context, now running on autopilot in your present life. The pattern doesn't know what year it is. It doesn't know that the environment has changed, that you've changed, that the original reason for the protection no longer applies. It just runs. And you, without realizing it, follow it and call it a decision. Some of the most significant moments in your life, the things you didn't do, the paths you didn't take, the version of yourself you didn't become, may not have been the result of genuine choice at all. They may have been the result of a pattern you never saw clearly enough to question. That's not a comfortable thought, but comfort has never been the same thing as clarity. Because once you see that many of your decisions were never fully yours, the question stops being, why did I do that? And becomes something far more useful. What is actually driving me? And is it still true? Living inside a smaller version of yourself. There's a range of life available to you, a range of expression, of action, of possibility, and somewhere inside that range, you've settled into a zone, a comfortable, familiar, predictable zone where you know how to operate and where the risks feel manageable. You don't call it that. You call it knowing yourself, being realistic, understanding your limits. But some of those limits aren't wisdom at all. They're just the edges of the image you built, mistaken for the edges of what's actually possible for you. And the most dangerous thing about living inside a smaller version of yourself is that it doesn't feel small. It feels like home. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius that most people live without ever truly beginning to live, not because life denied them, but because they accepted the first version of themselves that formed and never questioned it again. They optimized within their limits instead of examining whether the limits were real, and so they became very good at living inside a very small space and called it a complete life, because the smaller version of yourself is functional. It works. It gets through the day, maintains relationships, avoids major disasters. It produces enough comfort to make the question, is this really all I am, feel unnecessary, even ungrateful. But working and living aren't the same thing. And the quiet dissatisfaction that surfaces sometimes in moments of stillness when you watch someone else do something you always told yourself wasn't for you, that's not ingratitude. That's information. That's the part of you that knows the zone you're living in isn't the full territory. The psychological mechanism is precise. You don't act beyond what you can imagine for yourself. And what you can imagine is largely determined by the self-image you carry. If the image says you're someone who doesn't do that kind of thing, the action becomes almost unthinkable, not because it's impossible, but because it doesn't fit. And that discomfort is enough to stop most people before they even begin. Here's what's worth confronting directly. The life you're living right now is, in large part, a reflection of the version of yourself you believe in. Not the version you're capable of, the version you believe in. And if that version was built from incomplete material, shaped by approval and avoidance, then the life it's producing is also incomplete. Not ruined, not beyond repair, but incomplete. And incompleteness, when you finally see it clearly, doesn't feel like tragedy. It feels like possibility. The problem isn't that you've been living small. The problem is that small has started to feel normal. And normal, after long enough, stops feeling like a choice at all. The fear of seeing yourself differently. There's a moment that happens sometimes quietly when you catch a glimpse of something in yourself that doesn't fit the version you've been carrying. A capacity you didn't expect. A possibility that feels real for just a second before something inside you closes it down. And the closing happens fast. Before you can even examine what you just saw, the mind has already moved to contain it. explained it away, filed it under something safer. Luck, coincidence, an exception that doesn't really count. That closing isn't weakness. It's protection. But protection from what? From the implications of what you just saw. Because if that glimpse is real, if that capacity is genuinely yours, then something has to change. Not just what you do, but how you understand yourself. And changing how you understand yourself is one of the most destabilizing things a person can do. You've built your life around a certain understanding of who you are. Your decisions reflect it. Your relationships reflect it. And when something threatens to revise it, the mind doesn't respond with curiosity. It responds with resistance. Because revising the image means admitting that the decisions made from it may have been wrong, that the path taken may have been narrower than it needed to be. Carl Jung wrote that people will do almost anything to avoid genuine self-confrontation, not because they are cowardly, but because the psyche is organized around coherence. It needs the story of who you are to remain stable. Disrupting it, even in the direction of growth, triggers something that feels indistinguishable from threat. So the fear of seeing yourself differently isn't irrational. It's the mind doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is that a structure built for survival isn't always built for truth. Epictetus taught that the first and most important work of philosophy is to examine your own judgments, not to confirm them, but to test them. He understood that most people mistake familiarity for truth, and that this mistake is the root of most unnecessary suffering. And here's the specific fear that sits underneath all of this. If you see yourself more clearly and discover you're capable of more than you've been living, then you're also responsible for that. You can no longer explain the gap by pointing to limitation. Limitation, as painful as it is, provides an explanation. Remove it, and what's left is just the question of what you're going to do now. What you're afraid of finding isn't a worse version of yourself. It's a truer one, and a truer version, even when it's uncomfortable, is always more useful than a comfortable fiction. The Stoic practice of questioning perception. Marcus Aurelius was one of the most powerful men in the known world. He commanded armies, governed an empire, held authority most people never come close to. And yet the private journal he kept, what we now know as the Meditations, is not a record of decisions made or victories won. It's a record of a man constantly questioning his own mind. Not his enemies, not his circumstances, his own perception. In Meditations, Book 6, he wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events, but he didn't treat that as a comfortable idea. He treated it as a discipline, a daily, sometimes uncomfortable practice of returning to his own thoughts and asking, is this true? Is this perception accurate, or is it a habit? Is this clarity, or is it familiarity dressed up as clarity? That distinction between genuine perception and habitual perception is at the heart of Stoic philosophy. The mind wants to confirm, it wants to find evidence that what it already believes is correct. It wants to move through the world efficiently, using patterns it has already established. That's not a flaw, it's how cognition works. But it means that without deliberate intervention, your perception of yourself will default to whatever was established earliest and reinforced most often. And that default perception will feel like truth. Epictetus made this point directly in the Discourses. He said that it is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. Those judgments about what is possible, about who we are, about what we're capable of, are not neutral observations. They are interpretations, built from experience, shaped by circumstance, and if they are never examined, they become the invisible architecture of your life. The walls you never see because you've always lived inside them. The Stoic practice of questioning perception is about developing the habit of pausing between experience and interpretation, between what happens and what you tell yourself it means. That pause is where freedom lives, because in that pause you have the opportunity to ask, Is the version of myself I'm operating from right now actually accurate? Is this hesitation wisdom or a pattern from a context that no longer applies? Marcus Aurelius created that pause deliberately, every day, in writing. Not as therapy, but as maintenance. The ongoing, unglamorous work of keeping his perception honest. And what that practice revealed, over years of sustained examination, is that many of the things he was most certain about required revision. That confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. If you don't examine the perception you carry of yourself, someone or something else already did that work for you. Your environment did it. Your early experiences did it. The reactions of people who may not have seen you clearly did it. And you've been living from the result ever since. The Stoics didn't offer this as discouragement. They offered it as the beginning of something. Because the moment you recognize that your perception can be examined, the relationship you have with yourself begins to change. Seeing without defending yourself. There's a particular kind of honesty that most people never quite reach. Not because they're dishonest people, but because the honesty required here isn't about telling the truth to others. It's about seeing the truth about yourself, without immediately moving to soften it, contextualize it, or explain it away. The mind has a nearly automatic response to information that threatens the self-image. It defends, quietly and efficiently. It finds the angle that makes the uncomfortable thing less uncomfortable. It reframes the evidence until what was challenging becomes manageable, and you never quite notice it happening, because the defense doesn't feel like defense. It feels like perspective. Jung was precise about this. He wrote that the most dangerous thing of all is to mistake the persona, the constructed identity we present to the world, for the whole self. Because once that mistake is made, any information that contradicts the persona becomes a threat rather than data. And a mind in threat response mode is not a mind that can see clearly. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 10, that if someone can show you that you're thinking or acting incorrectly, you should be glad of it, not tolerant of it, not resigned to it, glad. Because correction is more valuable than the comfort of remaining wrong. Agreeing with that intellectually is easy. Sitting with a specific truth about yourself without explaining it away, that's where most people stop. There's an important distinction worth being precise about. Seeing yourself without defending yourself is not the same as being harsh with yourself. Self-criticism isn't clarity. It's often just another form of defense. The self-critic and the self-protector are doing the same thing, managing the image rather than seeing past it. Real clarity is quieter than both. It doesn't amplify and it doesn't minimize. It just looks. It holds the information without immediately deciding what it means for the story of who you are. Epictetus taught that the person who cannot endure the truth about themselves will never make real progress. Not because suffering is virtuous, but because the avoidance of honest perception is itself the obstacle. You cannot navigate accurately with a map you refuse to look at directly. And here's what most people discover when they finally develop this capacity. It's almost never as devastating as the defense suggested it would be. The mind treats the threat of honest self-perception as enormous. The actual experience of it is usually just quiet, uncomfortable, sometimes surprising, but survivable in a way the defense never quite believed. The shadow you've been carrying. There's a part of you that you don't talk about, not because you've decided to keep it hidden, but because you've stopped thinking of it as yours. It moved out of your conscious identity so gradually that you didn't notice it leaving. You just noticed at some point that certain capacities felt like they belonged to other people, that certain versions of yourself felt like exceptions rather than truth. That's not absence, that's displacement. Carl Jung spent decades mapping this territory. He called it the shadow, a precise psychological description of what happens to the parts of a person that don't fit the identity they've constructed. The shadow isn't what's wrong with you. It's what's been left out of the version of you that you've learned to present. And left out doesn't mean gone. What isn't integrated doesn't disappear. It operates. Beneath the surface, outside your awareness, in the reactions that seem disproportionate, in the longings that don't fit your self-image, in the patterns you repeat without understanding why. You've felt this. The irritation that surfaces when someone else does something you told yourself you didn't want to do. The pull towards something you immediately dismiss as not who you are. That dismissal isn't clarity, it's the shadow speaking from the other direction. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The parts of yourself you haven't examined don't stop influencing your behavior. They just do it without your participation, without your awareness, without giving you the opportunity to evaluate whether what they're producing is actually what you want. Epictetus taught in the Discourses that a person who does not know what they are made of cannot know what they are capable of. Self-knowledge for the Stoics wasn't a luxury, it was the foundation of every other form of wisdom. You cannot see clearly if large portions of who you are remain unexamined, shaping your life without your conscious participation. Integrating the shadow isn't a process of becoming someone different. It's a process of becoming more fully yourself, of recovering the range that was quietly narrowed by the need to fit, to be accepted, to maintain an identity others could recognize and approve of. And that recovery changes things in ways that are difficult to predict in advance, because you don't know what you're capable of when you're operating from only a portion of yourself. The moment the narrative breaks. There comes a moment, and it's rarely dramatic, when something you've believed about yourself stops holding together. It doesn't collapse all at once. It's more like a hairline fracture, a small inconsistency you notice, and then try to ignore, but can't quite unsee. A moment where the version of yourself you've been trusting gives you an answer that feels, for the first time, genuinely wrong. That moment is uncomfortable, but it's also the most important thing that can happen to you. Because up until that point, the narrative was invisible. It didn't feel like a narrative, and it felt like reality. You can't question what you can't see. But when the fracture appears, there's suddenly a gap. A small space between you and the story. And in that space, for perhaps the first time, you can see the story as a story. Jung described this as the beginning of individuation, the process through which a person moves from living an inherited identity toward building a genuine one. Individuation doesn't begin with insight. It begins with disruption. With the moment the existing structure reveals itself as insufficient, and that disruption has a specific emotional quality worth recognizing. It doesn't feel like liberation at first. It feels like disorientation, because the narrative, whatever its limitations, was also your orientation system. When it fractures, that stability wavers, sometimes with something that feels closer to grief. Because something is ending. Not you, but a version of you that carried you through years of your life. Letting it revise is not painless. Marcus Aurelius didn't write like a man who had achieved clarity and was maintaining it. He wrote like a man in the ongoing, sometimes difficult process of revising his own understanding of himself. He treated the persistent tendency to reassert old patterns not as failure, but as the nature of the work. But when the narrative breaks, and you stay with the breaking rather than immediately reaching for repair, something clarifies. You were never the narrative. The narrative was a tool, a map, a working model built in particular circumstances for particular purposes. You are larger than the map, and recognizing that changes what seems possible, not because your circumstances have changed, but because the frame through which you were reading your own capacity has shifted. The things that felt like they weren't for you begin to look different. The hesitations that felt like wisdom begin to look like habit. The version of yourself you'd settled into begins to look like a starting point rather than a conclusion. Acting from a clearer version of yourself. Everything that came before this was diagnosis. Necessary, honest, sometimes uncomfortable diagnosis. But diagnosis without application is just a more sophisticated way of staying in the same place. Understanding why you see yourself the way you do doesn't automatically change how you see yourself. And seeing yourself more clearly doesn't automatically change how you act. That gap between understanding and action is where most people stop. The patterns you've been running weren't built through understanding. They were built through repetition, through experience, through years of living in a particular way. And they don't dissolve because you've understood them intellectually. They dissolve through action. Specifically through action that contradicts them. Epictetus didn't teach his students to think differently and wait for their behavior to follow. He taught them to act differently, deliberately, repeatedly, in the specific situations where the old pattern would naturally reassert itself. Because every time you act beyond the boundary of your current self-image, you generate evidence, real, personal evidence that the boundary wasn't where you thought it was. And evidence, accumulated through direct experience, revises the image in a way that intellectual understanding never quite can. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 8, that it is enough to do good now, even if you remember nothing. He was talking about the trap of waiting for perfect clarity before acting. He understood that a person who waits until they see themselves completely clearly before acting will wait indefinitely. Because clarity of that kind doesn't precede action. It follows it. You don't act from a clearer version of yourself after you've fully understood the old one. You act from a clearer version of yourself in order to understand the old one. The action comes first. The clarity follows. And this is what makes it genuinely difficult. Because acting beyond your current self-image doesn't feel like growth in the moment. It feels like pretending, like doing something that isn't really you, which is, of course, precisely the point. It isn't the current you. It's a version that exists as potential rather than established identity. And moving toward it requires tolerating the discomfort of not yet knowing who that version is. Here's what the practice actually looks like in ordinary life. It looks like taking the action you would take if the hesitation weren't there, before the hesitation resolves. It looks like speaking from the part of yourself that knows more than the part that's afraid. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, in the small moments where the pattern surfaces and offers you the familiar choice. Each of those moments is a revision, small, quiet, accumulating. Because identity isn't changed by one large decision. It's changed by the weight of repeated experience that contradicts the old version of who you thought you were. You were never only the version of yourself that got approved. Those things shaped you, genuinely, significantly. But they are not the full story. They were never the full story. The full story is still being written. And what determines how it continues isn't what happened to you before. It's what you choose to see, and what you choose to do with what you see. Marcus Aurelius ended many of his private entries not with resolution but with return. A return to the practice. A reminder to himself that the work of seeing clearly isn't completed. It's sustained. Day after day, decision after decision, in the ordinary moments where perception either opens or closes, either questions or confirms. That's not an inspiring abstraction. That's the actual work. And it's available to you, not at some future point when you've understood everything clearly enough, but right now in exactly the circumstances you're already in, with exactly the version of yourself you're already carrying. The question was never whether you're capable of more. The question was whether you were willing to see past the version of yourself that learned to believe you weren't. You've been looking through a distorted lens for a long time, and distorted lenses, once you know they're there, can be examined, adjusted, and sometimes set aside entirely, so that for the first time you see not the version of yourself that was built for you, but the one that was always, quietly, already there.